Welcome to the WebMD Health Discovered podcast. I'm Dr. Neha Pathak, WebMD's Chief Physician Editor for Health and Lifestyle Medicine. Today, we're excited to host Dr. Sanjay Gupta in a conversation focused on the latest in assessing Alzheimer's dementia risk and the most robust evidence we have so far for preventing, managing, and even possibly reversing the findings normally associated with Alzheimer's. Dr. Sanjay Gupta is a practicing neurosurgeon, best-selling author of Keep Sharp, Build a Better Brain at Any Age, and an award-winning reporter. Dr. Gupta is renowned for his extensive work in brain health, and he and his team at CNN have recently released a documentary following the stories of people and their families as they contend with their genetic profiles, lifestyles, family history, and their own changing memories while they participate in clinical trials and research to further our knowledge about Alzheimer's disease risk assessments and treatment protocols. In an extraordinary personal endeavor, he even undergoes a battery of Alzheimer's risk testing himself, all to help us consider our own risk and advance the future of Alzheimer's prevention and potential reversal. According to the latest statistics, more than 6.9 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's dementia today. And with aging global populations, more than 152 million people around the world will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's by 2050. What does this mean for us as individuals, as caregivers, and as a global community? What are the steps we can take to assess risk and make sustainable changes in our lives? Today, we'll explore Dr. Gupta's personal journey and the making of his documentary, a 5-year endeavor that brings to light major insights in Alzheimer's prevention and treatment. We'll discuss the surprising findings, rigorous lifestyle interventions, and the profound impact of these discoveries on his own life and potentially yours. In interviews across 8 states, coast to coast, Dr. Gupta follows Alzheimer's patients through their courses of treatment and explains why so many experts are calling it the most hopeful era for Alzheimer's patients and their loved ones. I'm really excited to dig in as Dr. Gupta shares his unique insights on brain health, the role of lifestyle medicine, and how he's making simple but powerful changes in his daily life to enhance his cognitive well-being, whether it's through diet, exercise, social connections, or innovative testing methods. This episode is packed with actionable advice and thought-provoking conversation. Welcome to the WebMD Health Discovered podcast, Dr. Gupta.
Thanks so much, Doc. Thanks for having me.
The making of this documentary was a 5-year endeavor. I'd love to explore your own personal health discovery. What was your aha moment that led you to dedicate 5 years of your time to this topic?
That's a great question. I think when you start a project like this, you don't necessarily know how long it's going to go. So we didn't necessarily start saying we're going to do this for 5 years. In fact, when we started, I think there was some discussions about the fact that it may not amount to anything. And that's happened before, where you start actually working on a project, but it just doesn't pan out. You still have to start so that you can accrue some of that interesting early footage of the beginning of a trial, for example, but you have to leave yourself a little bit of wiggle room to know that maybe it doesn't pan out. I think for us, when we started to see some of the early results from the trials, we became increasingly convinced. And then I thought, well, how long is an appropriate amount of time to wait? And we sort of thought 5 years, just because if someone is going to have benefits and improvements or even a slowing down of decline, how long does that last? Is it a few weeks? Is it a few months? Is it a few years? People want durable sort of results. So we just sort of landed on 5 years. We also, as you well know, Neha, went through a pandemic in the middle of all that. So it was an opportunity for us in the background to continue to follow these characters along, even though we knew at that point we weren't going to probably put this thing on television.
So I'd love to talk about the prevention piece first. We know in a vast array of chronic diseases, a significant percent is potentially preventable based on modifiable risk factor adjustment. So, eating a healthy diet, increasing physical activity, avoiding smoking. We know, for example, 90% of type 2 diabetes, 80% of coronary artery disease, 70% of stroke is potentially preventable. How much of Alzheimer's is preventable?
If you had to put a number on it, and these are sort of early days, but if you had to put a number on it at this point, they would say around 40%. So not quite the same sort of rigor as you see with cardiac disease. But Neha, at the same time, I think, part of working on this, I went back and really looked at the aftermath of Framingham study. I think before Framingham, or at least around that time, there was a belief that heart disease was one of those things that either you got or you didn't. There wasn't a lot you could do about it. And the benefit of these modifiable risk factors was not clear at that point. We knew that there was a role, but it was just unclear how much of a role. That was, 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s. So 70 years ago. I think we're sort of where we were then with heart disease. We're there now with brain disease. So we're starting to see some of these data come back. And I think what has been the conventional wisdom for a long time, even for me, someone who has studied neuroscience, is that there's not a lot of modifiable risk factors. In fact, to the point where there was this huge dichotomy, I think, in the medical community, should you even get tested for your risk factors? What are you going to do about it? Which I never bought into because I'm an information guy, and I think information is always actionable in different ways to different people. But I think where we are now is that testing is valuable because there is something you can do about it. Medications, which we talked about, but certainly the lifestyle changes.
You, in your essay in particular, but in the documentary, also talk about the vast array of testing that you underwent. So, can you talk about what pieces of the testing were sort of what you expected, what we traditionally think of as testing for Alzheimer's risk, and then what were outside of those bounds and really surprising to you?
I will tell you, I think most of it was surprising to me. I think that maybe this is the case for you as well. I'm curious, but I think for the most part, people are used to having a biomarker, something that they understand and that they might even talk to their family about. My cholesterol is X, my blood pressure is X. So we're used to sort of having these relatively easy to obtain biomarkers that, give us a fair amount of information, objective data on our likelihood of developing something. I thought with regard to Alzheimer's dementia, the genetic testing would be something that I would certainly undergo, although that's been a topic of dispute again, because people say, well, what are you going to do with that information? I thought that I would certainly get a blood test for what is known as phosphorylated tau, which is now sort of in the lay world known as the Alzheimer's test. Kind of gives you an idea of your risk of Alzheimer's in the future. That sort of stuff I anticipated. What I don't think I really fully grasped was how involved, I would say, in a good way, but it was intimidating to go through the very, very sophisticated cognitive testing. And I remember walking out of there thinking this experience that I once had in Tel Aviv where I was flying out and I went through immigration and all of a sudden, I was flagged for extensive questioning. I don't know if this has happened to you, but they start to ask you questions and you really feel like they're uncovering things that you really hadn't even thought of yourself. Oh, you said you had lunch at this place on Thursday. Well, how did you get to this place over here by 2 o'clock that same day? Like I hadn't, I hadn't thought of that. With this, it was, quick. For the next minute, just start naming as many words as you can, starting with the letter G. And I challenge anybody to do this. I think you get to like 10 or 12 words and you start to hesitate and pause. And by the way, the longer the word, the better. The more unusual the word, the better. It's challenging. So I was sort of amazed and surprised at how detailed that level of testing. It's not a biomarker, but I think people think if it's not a biomarker, it has little value. And what I think I learned is that assessing brain health, we've come much further than I think people realize. This type of testing, whether it's cognitive testing, whether it's doing a DEXA scan to figure out how much muscle, fat, and bone I have in my body and where that is all located in my body, looking at smell tests, really understanding the correlation between smell abnormalities and future dementia. All of this was really, really interesting to me. And then just to take it a step further, maybe this is something you were going to ask, but they can so much more reliably correlate these test results with very, very functional aspects of brain function. It's not just, hey, this is going to affect your memory. No, this will affect your processing speed. So you're great at coming up with 60 words that start with the letter G, just not doing it very fast. That's a different problem than not being able to come up with the words at all. And those will be caused by different problems. One might be more related to depression, for example, whereas another one might be more related to a metabolic abnormality. They've come really far, Neha, in being able to actually correlate these things. And a lot of that, I think, came about over the last 10 years with the ECOG study and some other studies, which have been, I think, pretty transformative.
You note this in the documentary. We have a lot of these sort of binary tests that push you from a state of health to now having a certain condition that we have now diagnosed you with. And I found it really fascinating that some of these tests kind of let you get to a point where you're able to find things more on what we know is a spectrum of health. You don't generally go from being healthy one day to not the next day for many chronic conditions. I just found it really interesting that for a lot of people, it does take finding that piece of information. It does help people kind of see where they are on that spectrum and potentially then might help people make some of these lifestyle interventions. There's FOFO, there's the fear of finding out because you don't necessarily want to do things that aren't easy or what you're used to in your life. So I'm just curious what you think about that. Did that make an impact on you when you got these very specific levels?
People are motivated certainly in different ways. And I think the challenge I'm sure that you have as well with your patients is, I think the general messaging around prevention is do these things, eat right, exercise, spend time with friends, meditate. And as a result, nothing will happen to you. And that's not the most inspiring message. Or if there is a benefit, you're not going to see that benefit for decades down the line. I think where the conversation sort of goes a little bit with these guys, but also other people in the field of lifestyle medicine and functional medicine is, look, these are good things to do. We don't have to convince you of that. I know that they can be challenging, but here is the trade-off. The trade-off is that you will feel better now. You will be more productive. You'll be happier. You'll be healthier. You'll be able to do things you couldn't otherwise do. You won't hurt as much. You'll be a better son, daughter, colleague, whatever it might be now. And I think that was a big, big conversation topic when I was talking to all these patients. I don't think many of these folks who, especially, ate meat their entire lives were champing at the bit to basically go on a vegan diet. But I can tell you that for some of them, 5 years later, they were really still maintaining it in part because of how good they felt. So this is one of the paradoxes of prevention, I think. There is that huge white space, as I talked about in the essay, between being totally healthy and sick. There's a big space in between. And what I think when doctors typically tell patients, hey, man, you look fine, what they're really saying is at this point in time and for the next few years, you're fine. But I think as part of the conceit of lifestyle medicine is that it's a longer timetable that they're looking at. This comes up a bit, by the way, with things like obesity. The American Medical Association in 2015 said obesity in and of itself is considered a disease. Now, what if you have normal blood pressure, normal lipids, you're not insulin resistant, you're functional in terms of your body, you're not hurting, you don't have sleep apnea? Do you still have a disease by virtue of your weight alone? I think it's a fair question. And I think it's sort of the same thing here is like, I don't have a problem right now. But there was enough that Richard saw that was concerning, frankly, to him to say down the line, there are things that you need to be doing now to avoid those problems 15, 20 years from now.
Right. And I think it's really interesting in terms of the dose dependence of some of these interventions, right? I guess the more room you give, the earlier you start, the more gradual you can make some of these changes. So I'm just curious about how you're digesting some of this information in your own life. How are you thinking about making some of these changes?
There was very specific things that were recommended to me, and I'm not on the program, Dean Orsh's program, but I'm doing the recommendations that Richard Isaacson made for me. To be honest, Neha, I don't find it that challenging. I do agree the point you made earlier. My efforts are sort of redoubled, and I feel really good about it because now I have some payoff that I'm seeing in terms of what the data is showing will happen if I adopt these lifestyle changes. And I was worried about it given what I saw happen to my own grandfather. That was pretty jarring. I don't know if you had anybody in your family who's had Alzheimer's, but it is it's a little bit hard to explain because people, they typically understand it as a memory robbing sort of disease, but it's more personality robbing disease. Someone who is just my grandfather's the kindest, most gentle soul, a partition child, got his family across the border in 1947 and just the sweetest guy. And he became angry and he was a jokester. And then all of a sudden, none of the jokes he was telling would make any sense. And he was living with us, and yet we were all like on eggshells around him all the time, all these things. And then you're like, wow, that's such an interesting thing. And then he would have these functional neurological problems where he developed alexia without agraphia, which means that he could write just fine, but he could not read. He could not read what he just wrote. He could speak just fine, but he had trouble understanding. So he's able to express himself through written and spoken communication, but could not receive that communication as well. It was really strange. It was almost like having had a stroke on top of the Alzheimer's symptoms, but it was all Alzheimer's for him. And so it was a challenging time. And I think when you hear now about the optimism that people have as a result of doing these things based on data that could, make an objective difference, 40% reduction in risk, I think is pretty significant. I don't find it that hard. I do eat meat, but since the results of this, I don't eat it much. Our sort of family philosophy is we just don't keep it in the house. But if I go out to eat, I might order it. After a while, I don't really miss it as much, but I might order it. Now, since this, I've not been ordering any meat. I just eat vegetarian and I use a ruck vest, which was really interesting to me and something I highly recommend. It's very hard to build skeletal muscle. It's very hard to stimulate bone remodeling in your spine and in your long bones, but simply adding weight to your walks can accomplish a lot of that. It helps reduce visceral fat. I'm not doing anything more than I used to do other than these dietary changes and now these types of walks, and I've lost, several pounds doing that just over a couple of months. It feels like it's very much worth it to me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's just really, really fascinating to see in depth how you can really shift some of your behaviors and you can get really granular about it. I mean, I picked up the rucksack sort of tidbit from your essay, and I am going to go out and buy one.
I get it. The challenges certainly of a busy lifestyle and all that. When you cite the number that maybe 70% of chronic disease in this country is preventable, I would say that the vast majority of that is probably has to do with how we nourish ourselves. And it's a problem. You've heard this 1,000 times. I've heard it 1,000 times, but you go to other countries, and I'm talking about developed countries, countries that have similar economies to ours and have, working parents and things like that. And there's totally different food supply chains. People often say, what do I need to do in order to get healthier? And I will say a lot of times the question almost is more, what do you need to stop doing? And, and again, this isn't an indictment or any kind of criticism, but the ultra processed foods, I think are so much a part of that problem of really setting up people for chronic disease, primarily probably through inflammation in their bodies. Look, I carry inflammation in my body that surprised me. I don't feel sick. I don't feel inflamed. I exercise every day, but I carry a lot of inflammation. Some of that I think a lot of that is probably from things that I'm taking in. Some of that might be from just even emotional health, mental health. People don't, I think enough about the combination and the interplay between brain and body with regard to things like Alzheimer's. That was why the meditation and yoga was such a big part of Dean Ornish's program. A lot of people will look at this and say, seems kind of woo-woo. And look, I'm a neurosurgeon. I get it. You and I both trained in Western medicine and that establishment, but it should again shock nobody that there is a correlation between brain and body health, and that through these lifestyle changes, you can make a big difference quickly. It can be hard, but the payoff is so tremendous. So, we've essentially eliminated processed and ultra processed foods in our house. I have 3 teenagers, so I mean, we're not. I don't want to sound Pollyannish. It's challenging,
Okay.
but that was how we approached it. If you're gonna eat that stuff, we're gonna make it harder for you to get. And by the way, just having bowls of fruit and vegetables and stuff like that on the counter on a regular basis, I don't find it that hard. I don't find it that challenging. So Again, I live in this society. I know the challenges of it. We're busy people, but the payoff, I think, as we saw in this documentary, are tremendous.
I want to thank you so much for your time. I love to end each episode with bite sized action items for listeners that they can implement in their daily lives. So, what would be some of those tips that people can walk away with?
I think there's a lot of obvious ones. I think, I think people need to be very intentional about how they're nourishing their bodies. And I'm using nourishment as opposed to diet on purpose. Just really think about that. I kept a food diary as part of the process after meeting with Richard. You surprise yourself sometimes in terms of the food you're taking in mindlessly. Activity and movement is something that is often the first thing to fall off your calendar when your day gets busy. It should be the last thing. It is the ultimate form of self-care, and I think it makes a huge difference, as we know, with regard to our bodies, but also, as we saw with the documentary, in our brains as well. There were little other things as well, like we talked about the rucksack, and I mentioned toe spacers in my essay. The longest nerves in the body run from the bottom of the spinal cord, the cauda equina, to your feet. And people don't always realize that signals aren't just coming from your central nervous system to your peripheral nervous system, but they're going back as well. And for people who wear shoes a lot and aren't feeling their toes on the sand or the grass or the ground, that two-way street is sort of really inhibited. So making sure at least you're activating all those nerves on a regular basis. I think something that was said to me as well was that the first light of your day, the first light that your eyes see, as much as possible, make that natural light instead of artificial light. So resist the urge to immediately pick up your phone and look at it, and instead go open the drapes and get some sunlight on your face and just, spend a minute doing that. You'll find that it's pretty magical. And then I would say, and this may be the case for you as well, Neha, just, when you're going to medical school and you're doing training and stuff, I mean, for me, 7 years of training and then a year of fellowship after medical school, I was never a particularly social person. And my brother and I joke about it. My brother is Mr. Social, Mr. Personality. I wasn't that guy, never was. And it was funny because we go to family gatherings and everyone always gravitated to my brother, but I was always like the curmudgeon guy in the background. But I think during COVID, and I think as a result of, working on this documentary as well, the tangible objective benefit of social interaction, I think, is real. We know this, and if you want a mechanism for why it's real and understand how, your oxytocin levels might change, how your cortisol levels may go down just in response to people, you can find that evidence. But the reality is, I think we continuously need a context bubble for the world. When people talk about brain fog, I think a lot of times they're in their heads too much. And, when you interact with people, you're constantly trialing new ideas and new thoughts and having these conversations, which make a big deal. And if you can be vulnerable around more and more people, if you can identify half a dozen people in your life that you'd be very willing to ask for help from, even better. Those are some of the most profound relationships in your life. So those are some of the things I put at the top of the list. Doing these things now. I'm a guy in my mid-50s now. Doing these things now, I think, greatly increases the chances that I will be of strong body and sound mind as long as possible for my kids. Life is a 100% fatal disease. We know that. If we could potentially live forever, maybe we'd be having a different discussion. But for the time that we're here, we can live much healthier lives, really expand that health span. And as you know, there are countries around the world. They don't have new therapies. They don't have new medications. They haven't come up with a new surgical technique that we don't have. And yet they live profoundly, objectively better lives than we do. These are some of the hacks to get there.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Gupta. We really appreciate your time. We've talked with Dr. Sanjay Gupta about the small behavior changes to your lifestyle that you can make starting today that will reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease and also provide additional benefits like reducing your risk for other chronic health conditions. You can watch The Last Alzheimer's Patient on CNN's The Whole Story with Anderson Cooper, streaming on Max and Discovery Plus on June 18th. We'll also link to Dr. Gupta's essay in our show notes. To find out more information about Dr. Gupta, check out CNN and their podcast, Chasing Life with Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Thank you so much for listening. Please take a moment to follow, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. If you'd like to send me an email about topics you're interested in or questions for future guests, please send me a note at webmdpodcast@webmd.net. This is Dr. Neha Pathak for the WebMD Health Discovered podcast.